Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yesterday, Senator Baldwin followed me, and I'm following her now today. One thing I wish we could all agree on is that we actually share the same goal. I think we all want a prosperous America. We want every American to be able to build a good life for themselves and their family. We're concerned about every American. If we could first establish that, it would go a long way toward, actually developing relationships, developing trust, and coming to agreement. And let's face it, neither side's going away. If we're going to solve these very difficult problems, it's going to have to be on a bipartisan basis, and I certainly am very sincere in my desire to do that. But let's face it, we have very different views on how you accomplish that goal. We have very different views on what the extent of the problem is. For example, President Obama today, he was reported, he said, we don't have an immediate crisis in terms of debt. In fact, for the next 10 years, it's going to be in a sustainable place. Now, maybe it's not an immediate crisis, but I tell you, I wish I shared his optimism in terms of the rosy scenario over the next 10 years. One of the problems, or one of the reasons I'm concerned, is just the average interest rate that we've been experiencing. I've got a chart here that from 1970 to 1999, the average interest rate the federal government paid on its debt was 5.3%. When we were a far more creditworthy nation, our debt-to-GDP ratio was 40 to 67%. Now, as Senator Sessions says, it's over 100%, and we've been borrowing at 1.5% for the last 3 years as the Federal Reserve has been printing money. If global investors take a look at the U.S. and say, you know what, I'm not going to loan you money, not at that rate, and we just return to that average, that would add $600 billion per year to our interest expense. And, of course, the CBO is predicting that we're going to head in that direction over the next 10 years. So that's highly concerning. Another little factoid that I sometimes use in my PowerPoint presentation that most people don't realize, I think Senator Toomey mentioned Greece. America's average, or America's share, every American's share of our federal debt is over $52,000. In this respect, we'd be better off being a citizen of Greece, because a citizen of Greece's share of Greece's federal debt is $36,000. We blew by Greece in the last 4 years, and the only reason that we don't have riots in the street is because we have the printing press, and that's what's been happening. So, fortunately, I don't know any parent that would willingly drive up their own personal debt, max out their credit cards with no intention whatsoever of paying that debt off, but fully intending to pass it on to their children and grandchildren. And yet, collectively, as a society, as a nation, that's exactly what we are doing. Personally, I think that's immoral. That is something we must come to grips with. So, how do we come to a bipartisan agreement? Well, I'll tell you one thing I learned in business. The first step in any negotiation is you got to sit down, develop those relationships, and I was one of those senators fortunate enough to have President Obama invite us for dinner. I appreciate that fact. You got to develop relationships. You got to develop trust. But then the first step is you have to spend a lot of time figuring out what you agree on. Now, let's make sure we're agreeing on the same facts and figures. During that dinner, President Obama made a pretty interesting statement. He accurately assessed our biggest problem is health care and the cost of Medicare, especially in the second and third decade. And he said, part of the problem in reforming it is Americans paying $1 into Medicare, but they're going to get $3 out in benefits. The real figure is actually about $1.16 and get $3.52 out. When I had my chance to talk to President Obama, I went right to that statement. I said, Mr. President, you're right. Folks on our side are trying to point that out. We don't hear that out of the folks on the other side. So it would be enormously helpful in terms of coming to grips with what we need to do with Social Security so we save it for future generations, with Medicare so that program's around. If we can together honestly describe the problem to the American public, let's stop pulling the wool over their eyes. The first step of solving any problem in a 12-step program is, first of all, you got to identify what are you? Are you an alcoholic, a gambler? And then once you start that 12-step program, what do? You raise your hand, you say, I've got a problem. And that's what we have to do. If we're going to come to grips with that, we must do that. So, again, let's figure out what we agree on. I think, unfortunately, we have a pretty large agreement in the general direction. I think the solution on your side, heartfelt, I think you believe it, is that you truly believe the solution is in growing government. Our side just happens to think that government more often is more of the source of the problem, not particularly efficient or effective at most things it does. Our approach is let's grow the private, the productive sector. The goal here would be that every American gets a check from an employer, that they have the dignity of a job so they can earn their success as opposed to getting checks from government. Thank you, Madam Chair.